friends. Uncle Marv here with a very special newscast for the IT Business Show. And it seems as though MSPs are being targeted more than ever. And it is probably not more prevalent than this recent ransomware that has happened, DragonForce. And let's just real quick recap what we're talking about here. DragonForce is a sophisticated ransomware-as-a-service operation known for targeting organizations across multiple sectors. And why is it making news now? Where it just simply hacked an MSP that was using the RMM tool SimpleHelp, and not only got into the MSP, but also into its clients. So it is making news there. Basically, the attackers exploited critical vulnerabilities in SimpleHelp, and by compromising the MSP RMM, attackers gained access to downstream client environments. They used chain vulnerabilities to achieve privilege escalation, arbitrary file uploads, path traversal, and they enabled full control of the RMM server. So DragonForce basically got put out to multiple endpoints, encrypted data, and stole sensitive information for double extortion. Now, the MSP in question, I'm assuming it's only one because that's kind of how they made it sound, has not been named. But I have a feeling that as more comes out about this, probably some MSPs will be named. But obviously, they named Simple RMM as the tool. And for those that do not know, SimpleHelp is a popular remote monitoring and management tool used by MSPs to support managed client IT environments. There were 3 vulnerabilities that were known about in January, and I'll have a link to articles that talk about this, but there were 3 CVEs that are particularly mentioned, and we'll talk about that. But to help me go over this and to talk about its implications, I'm bringing in one of the channel's most noted talents, Dave Sobel with MSP Radio, and we'll get his thoughts on what this means for us. Dave, welcome to the show.
Oh, Marv, thanks for having me back. You always come with such interesting things to talk about, so it's a pleasure to be here.
I hope they're interesting, and I hope we get some very good tips out to people listening to the show. But let me first ask your thoughts about this. When I reached out and told you I wanted to talk about it, what's your takeaway?
So it was interesting because I was actually taking a look at the story literally as you were reaching out to me and trying to do my analysis and make a decision like how much do we care? I always ask the question, why do we care? And at first glance, a lot of it was very similar themes, right? And I was almost too quick to dismiss it. Let's start with the statement of like, I feel bad for any MSP that gets hacked. Like, I mean, I just think that let's start with these are criminals doing criminal behavior, and I don't condone that. And that is the headline. Now, let's analyze beyond that. Disclosed and patched threats become weapons when IT hygiene slips. You noted that these were patched in January. You and I are talking at the end of May,
Yeah.
right? That is not. We're not talking about hours. We're not talking about days. We're talking about months. When your IT hygiene slips, that's when these things become weapons. So that's kind of like that was my first take is okay, like look, and that's almost why I was a little dismissive. I also then want to note SimpleHelp RMM is not in the top 5, right? They're not a top 5 player.
Right.
They are so, but you know, there's a diversity of space, and I like seeing competition in the space. They are primarily an on-premises installation system, and I don't mind saying my incredible bias to it's 2025. Cloud systems, SaaS solutions for stuff which have a security attack surface needs to be managed aggressively. I don't buy into on premises in 2025.
But Dave, let's not forget that other of the known platforms have been hacked as well. There was the Logic 4 that came out and hit Datto RMM. Enable has had its issues. So it's not like MSPs are wrong to say, hey, they're vulnerable as well.
They are wrong. And here's what and this is why, is because it's about reducing attack surface and who's responsible for it. If you're putting that system on premises and managing it yourself, you are now responsible for that attack surface and all of the other attack surfaces. Your job is to minimize the attack surface, and a cloud system allows a large hyperscaler to take over a portion of that. The developer themselves of the software takes responsibility for that. You've got a pretty solid case for going after the provider if they didn't patch for several months. Like, that's literally, again, we're talking about cyber hygiene here. This provider didn't do it, but they also were responsible for that. The job is to take care of the things that you are best at. That automated system and the ability to roll out patches, these larger players are better at that because they've built the system out for it. And I'll just sort of say, like, again, nothing's perfect. It's about risk reduction, and you're trying to take on the risk that you're good at managing. Are you the best bet? And again, let's break this down with a little bit of data, right? The attack surface of RMMs is now increasingly a threat. CrowdStrike researchers found a 70% increase in the use of RMM tools in cyber attacks. Proofpoint analysts wrote a rapid expansion in their use of noting of the RMM software by threat actors, particularly in first stage use cases, and apparently at the expense of other tools. I mean, they're leaning into using RMMs over like botnets and loaders because they're finding it's more effective, right? So
Right.
you've got to be really good at this. Cybersecurity firm Intel 471, in a report back in March, wrote that the RMM tools, including, and they named AnyDesk, Atera, Mesh Agent, Net Support Manager, Quick Assist, Screen Connect, Splashtop, and TeamViewer, are attractive to the bad actors for the exact same reason that MSSPs and MSPs use them, because it's easy access
Yeah.
to all of those customer systems.
Absolutely. And if they get into a known MSP's stack, whether you have 100 or 1,000 endpoints, those are endpoints that attacker doesn't have to mine. They're already
Yeah.
there. There's already access, and they can run PowerShell scripts. They can, use the script kiddies inside the packages and deploy with basically, no friction.
Yeah,
So
right.
I hear you.
Exactly. And I would question, just again, think attack surfaces. I would question how many MSPs like leave access to RMM tools open to anyone on the internet. Well, for that seemed like administrators probably are coming if
You're
from a
talking
country of
you're talking
origin.
about the self-hosted ones where you just open a port in the firewall so that your techs can get in from
Right.
anywhere, anytime.
Yeah. So again, like, people say, I know how to do it best. Well, do you? Have you implemented a trust architecture that actually verifies crossing into your network? Are you just exposing it to the internet? Well, that seems like extra risk, right? Like, again, you're not even necessarily thinking like the attacker and doing the basics. And so again, I just want to question the premise of these people saying, I know how to do it. Do you? Like, do you really? And are you doing all of that stuff with an active SOC that's keeping an eye on this, that's doing all of the active responsiveness? Note, by the way, Sophos is the group that discovered this.
Right.
Sophos' managed endpoint detection is the one that reported all of this. They're clearly bigger than most MSPs with their security operations center. Again, focus on what you're good at, and note that it is okay to give control of those things to large groups. So those are my first takes. And then the final thing was, you asked what I thought was interesting here. I think DragonForce themselves actually are the headline. Let's kind of highlight how aggressive they've been recently. DragonForce is also the group behind the Marks and Spencer and the Co-op hacks in the UK. They were involved in the Ohio Lottery hacks in 2023. They've attacked Coca-Cola. They've attacked government systems in Palau. Like, they are aggressive, and they, by the way, only launched their software in 2024. If you think of them in startup terms, if we think of them as a tech company, they're incredibly impressive. By the
Yes.
way, do you know some of the details of the way that they're deploying and their model of revenue sharing?
I do not know the revenue sharing.
Well,
I
let
do
me
know.
bring this out. because MSPs, you'll be fascinated by this. They are a full software as a service deployment, right? So you get, if you are a customer of DragonForce, I'm using those terms intentionally, right? You're a
Okay.
customer of DragonForce. You get pre-built infrastructure. You get access to the software. You get white labeled ransomware kits that you can put your own unique brands, compile your own binaries, customize the ransom note, file extensions. You get access to their negotiation tools, encrypted storage, templated leak sites so that you can leak out the on automatically. And it's a 20% revenue share. It's a lower commission than any of the other competitors are. You keep 80% of what you go out and hunt for as them. And by the way, they've moved in and consolidated in exact same words. They are mergers and acquisitions group. When Ransom Hub disappeared in April of 2025, they moved in and absorbed all of their affiliates, pulling themselves as an agile alternative ready to take over for a collapsing competitive business. They're really leaning into the idea of anonymity, flexibility, and profit to drive growth in the ransomware as a service sector. They're an impressively run organization.
Yeah, they have that franchise model. It is really just working for them. They are also very robust. I mean, they have AES 256 and RMA, RSA encryption. They are able to target Windows, Linux, VMware, NAS environments. I mean, it is just amazing what they've been able to do. So, for the people that look at this and say, "Oh, if you're hosting on Windows, move to Linux." Eh, DragonForce is there too.
So everybody in the MSP space always talks about this switching platforms. Like you eat your brain even went to it, Marvin. Like you said, like, people will think of switching from Windows to Linux.
Right.
It's not about the technology. It's about the process and procedure around it to minimize risk, right? And making intelligent decisions about what the attack surface is going to be, what you're exposing, and for what reasons. And I think that process, there's a lot of bias built into the way solution providers have been doing this. Some of them have technical debt, right? If you've been a business that has been running a long time, maybe you bought an on-prem server when that was the only way to do it, and it's really hard to move in. Well, the risk continues to grow up, to grow here. I would, again, if I were thinking about this in terms of my fresh take, like you always think about this, if I was starting the business today, what would I do? And perhaps you would lean into different selections of your software stack. You might not even use the same solutions, right? You might question a persistent RMM tool. Like, do you need it? Look, this is one of those third rails that MSPs are going to lose their minds on making
Yeah,
suggestions.
that's going to be a tough one because we want to be able to have access when we want it. So, how close to on demand can we get without having that persistent state is probably the question we need to look at.
It's worth examining, right? And there's different approaches to it, and you can continue to see. I'm going to sort of, as we tie up. I talked about this a little bit on my show, and I appreciate the opportunity to go more deep into it. But the story that I was going to run as my headline, which ran as my third story yesterday, was Microsoft's announcement of the Microsoft orchestration APIs to allow third parties to do patching in Windows Update. Let that sink in for a
I missed
second,
that
right?
one.
Right. So by the way, that was my third story on yesterday's show. And the reason I bring that up right now is we're talking about this hack, which again, incredible sympathies to the MSP that's dealing with these criminals. And I'm on board with fighting criminals. But actually, what we should be doing is starting to think about, like, how do we re-architect the way we do this? Patching is a big deal. Well, Microsoft is pushing to now start allowing third parties to do it through Windows Update. This feels like a really important decision that we need to start pushing those third-party vendors to get their systems into Windows Update so that you can do it through a centralized patch management system run by the operating system. Like, this feels like an important move in the way that we approach patching, and that will diminish the need for RMM tools who've been talking about, like, well, we're your patch solution. Well, you might not need to be going forward. And then we could start maybe re-architect, ask the question. I'm not saying I have the answer, and I'm not saying I'm necessarily think this is all perfect, but ask the question. You talk about you need access when you need it every time. Well, do you? Do you actually need it during business hours? And do you really need it more like when it's mutual agreement between you and the customer that it's time to do it. Because we can actually be much more careful about those sessions that they're more on demand and not available all the time, which might make everybody safer.
Right.
Right?
Well,
You don't. So just I think it's worth asking the questions, the hard questions, as an IT service provider, as an MSP. Just because you've done it that way for 20 years, does that mean it's the best way to do it now?
right. That brings up that topic you mentioned earlier, zero trust. If we're persistent, are we really doing zero trust? Not really.
Not really.
So it seems as though we've got a couple of things that MSPs should take away from this. One, you started at the top, patching. Known vulnerabilities that are left open, either because we're not paying attention or we say we'll get to it later. We got to stop that. We got to patch them when we know about them. To the idea of, this persistent state, zero trust. And then, of course, the fact that Sophos noticed it. So having, managed detection and response
Mhm.
is key when it comes to this. So our old school, antivirus malware may not be enough anymore.
No, I mean, I think we're well beyond that, and I would, and I make a pretty clear argument to the industry that I think at this point, lack of cyber hygiene is probably malpractice.
Mm.
If I was asked to testify in court about an MSP, like a client versus an MSP about this, and there was any incident of basic cyber hygiene, patching, two-factor authentication, basic backup and disaster recovery that wasn't done, as an industry expert, I would testify that that MSP has conducted malpractice. Just think
Well,
about that.
I mean, that's starting to be the case. I mean, I've highlighted a few cases already. We talked, last year there was the Land Tech, company that
Mhm,
got sued by its client. Reliable Networks got sued.
mhm.
Just a week ago, I talked about Entirety MSP being sued by its healthcare provider, that they're all coming after us, quotes there, because we're the ones that are charged with protecting their environments.
Right,
And
exactly,
if we're
and
not
there's a
keeping
threshold of compliance, right? There's a basic, and there we talk about best practices. Well, if you don't do them, like, yeah,
right.
if you don't do them, and you have to recognize that failure and best practices change, right? The idea of what is the modern baseline for technology changes over time, and you've got to continue to invest, and you've got to question those ideas. A lot of MSPs fail in the idea of thinking that standardization means no change. That's not what it means. Standardization means that I have a standard that I enforce against my client base, but additionally, I re examine that standard on an ongoing basis and continue to improve it over time. That's oftentimes why they're like frameworks and governance ideas are all version, right? That was my standard version 2028. I'm going to the 2029 in a few years. But by the way, don't make sure you're not running on the standard 2015 version, right? Which is now 10 years out of date. Standards change. So MSPs who think the idea of, oh, I must standardize my clients, you're only getting half the conversation.
Well, standardize, baseline, and what's best practice for one client may not be best practice for another client.
Yeah.
We've got to really pay attention to all of that. So, very interesting things to think about. Dave, thank you very much for hopping in and giving me your thoughts. You took me for a loop there with the RMM. Do we really need RMMs in this day and time?
By the way,
Interesting
for
question.
anybody who's skeptical in this, I know MSPs that are operating today without an RMM.
Oh,
So don't think that this is a statement that I'm making in pure theory. I know of MSPs that operate this way.
all right. We'll have to come back and revisit that on another show.
Fair enough.
But Dave Sobel with MSP Radio, host of the Business of Tech podcast. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Folks, that's going to do it. We'll be back with another episode soon. Until then, holla.